Over the past few years, there's been a growing interest in creating mobile marine protected areas. In this video, we will look at what mobile marine protected areas are, why they might be used, and the benefits of using them in addition to static protected areas. This was also the topic of our reading by Chelsea Harvey from Scientific American. Marine protected areas essentially evolved out of taking the concepts of terrestrial protected areas and applying them to the ocean. Basically, just like on land, lines were drawn on the map to delineate which areas were to be protected. Now on land, this strategy makes sense because terrestrial habitats generally don't move around. Of course, climate change is throwing a wrench into this, but that's a topic for another day. In the ocean, there are some static habitats like coral reefs, kelp forests, and seamounts, so drawing a line around them and declaring a protected area is an appropriate approach. And indeed, this is where a lot of the marine protected areas effort has been focused. But there are other habitats in the ocean that move around seasonally or even daily, including the positions of ocean fronts and currents. One example of a moving feature in the ocean is the North Pacific Transition Zone, which is shown on the maps here. The zone is where the warm, nutrient-poor subtropical waters meets the cool, nutrient-rich subpolar waters. This produces a highly productive habitat that attracts many species, including pelagic predators like tuna, blue sharks, and elephant seals. The zone also serves as a key migratory corridor for species such as bluefin tuna and loggerhead sea turtles. The zone is about 9,000 kilometers wide, and it shifts about 1,000 kilometers north to south between the summer and winter seasons. Because of this enormous area, if you try to draw a rectangle around the whole area of ocean where it could be, you end up with something so large that is likely to never be protected because of all of the potential human conflicts in an area that large. Realistically, something that large will just never be protected, at least not effectively. But a more dynamic approach, protecting just where the transition zone is at any given time, could reduce a lot of this conflict and maximize biodiversity conservation. Because of the dynamic nature of the ocean, many experts have suggested that a dynamic approach to ocean conservation is needed. One important tool that has been proposed to make ocean conservation more dynamic is the Mobile Protected Area, which is a protected area that rapidly changes in space and time in response to changes in the ocean and its users through the integration of near real-time biological, oceanographic, social, and/or economic data. You can think of it kind of like weather forecasting. We'll use modeling and data to tell us where species are likely to be in the future, whether that be next year, next week, or even tomorrow, and then use this information to help us plan human activities in the ocean accordingly. Within mobile marine protected areas boundaries, human activities would be restricted, just like they are in static MPAs. But these boundaries would move based on the movement of the habitat or species being protected. Protecting species that move has been a goal of conservation for decades, but having protections that follow them in near real time has not been possible. But it is becoming more realistic because of advances in technology over the last couple of decades. Mobile protected areas have been suggested to be particularly useful on two key fronts: to aid in the protection of migratory species and to help with conservation's response to climate change. Let's look at how mobile marine protected areas could help with each of these two issues in more detail. We have talked about the importance of connectivity quite a bit in this course already, but we have mainly discussed it in terms of terrestrial ecosystems. But connectivity is just as important in marine ecosystems and marine conservation. Just as we saw with terrestrial species, many marine species undertake huge migrations, either seasonally or as part of their life histories. And these migrations can be quite long, with some species crossing entire oceans. But instead of being all spread out across the entire ocean, migratory marine species tend to congregate in particular areas at different times of the year. Mobile marine protected areas have been suggested as a way to strengthen the protection of these species by shifting the areas under protection at any given time to be where these species are most likely to be. Essentially, the idea is that the boundaries of protected areas should move with the species they are meant to protect. Mobile protected areas will also be a useful tool in the conservation fight against climate change, as it will allow for protected areas to move with habitats as they migrate in response to climate change. As species and habitats shift across space and time, mobile marine protected areas could be used to protect dynamic ocean habitats critical for ecosystem function, such as fronts, currents, or eddies, or to protect individual species or groups of species. This will help to future-proof the ocean conservation system against shifts due to climate change by leaning into and embracing change by offering protection when key species or habitats shift outside of their current static protected area's boundaries. Instead of the species or habitat losing its protection when it moves, the protected area would move with it. One challenge that is worth noting here, though, is that not all species will move in response to climate change at the same time, or even in the same direction. So there will be questions that will need to be answered around when and how an MPA should move in response to climate change. One example of a dynamic approach to marine conservation that is already being used is NOAA's Turtle Watch map, which displays up-to-date information on sea surface temperatures and where sea turtles might be, which helps fishing vessels avoid the areas where the turtles might be, resulting in the reduction of turtle bycatch. What they did was put satellite tags on loggerhead and leatherback sea turtles in the North Pacific, and over time they developed models that allowed them to predict where the turtles were likely to be. As it turns out, sea surface temperature is actually a really strong predictor of where turtles will be, so this has allowed NOAA to create maps, like the one shown here, that are shared with the fishing industry on a weekly basis that basically say if you were to fish where the water is this temperature, you're likely to run into turtles. So go ahead and fish, just do so outside of this band. At this point in time, Turtle Watch is a voluntary program and only operating around Hawaii, but it has been well received by the fishing industry in that area, and it could serve as a template for more enforceable mobile marine protected areas or for similar initiatives in other jurisdictions. It is important to mention that dynamic marine protected areas are not meant to replace static protected areas. Instead, they are viewed as a complementary tool. There are also some challenges that need to be addressed in order to make mobile marine protected areas a reality. First is the challenge of enforcement. This is not a unique challenge to mobile marine protected areas, as we know that in order to be effective, protected areas need to be enforced. Remember back to the last video and the Neoli factors. Enforcement is always a challenge with marine protected areas, but adding in the dynamic aspect adds a whole new layer to the challenge. Another major hurdle to overcome will be that of technology. In order to make this concept work, there needs to be extensive wildlife surveys, sophisticated prediction models, the computer and skill capacities to put it all together, and the communication channels and willingness of fisheries, shipping, and other ocean industries to make it happen. While there have been a lot of advances on this front since the concept was first proposed about 20 years ago, there is still room for advancement. Finally, even if the technology is there to make this happen, the legal and policy frameworks that would be required to implement mobile marine protected areas are still a challenge. Like all protected areas, the political will to make them happen will be a key ingredient in mobile protected areas.